There is a moment in almost every person's life that feels impossible to explain. It usually arrives without warning, not during the relationship, not during the happiest memories, but long after everything has fallen apart. It happens on an ordinary afternoon. You remember someone you once believed you could never live without, their voice, their smile, the way they looked at you. For a brief instant, the memory still feels beautiful. Then something shifts, almost imperceptibly. A quiet question rises from somewhere deep inside your mind. Did I ever truly know that person, or did I only know the story I created about them? Few questions are more disturbing because it forces you to consider something the human ego desperately wants to avoid. Perhaps your greatest heartbreak was never caused by another person. Perhaps it was caused by the collapse of an illusion. Carl Jung believed that the human mind is not a passive observer of reality. It is an active creator. Every encounter is filtered through memories, through desires, through fears, through childhood wounds, through unconscious expectations that were formed long before we ever met the people we believe we love. This means something extraordinary. Two people can meet the exact same individual and fall in love with two completely different people because neither one is seeing reality. Each is seeing a projection. Projection is one of the most powerful psychological forces Jung ever described. It quietly paints missing pieces onto another human being. You notice kindness once, and your mind assumes integrity. You experience emotional intimacy one evening, and suddenly you imagine emotional maturity. Someone understands one hidden part of you, and before long, your imagination has transformed them into the only person capable of understanding your soul. Reality never made those promises. Your unconscious did. That is why disillusionment feels so violent. It is not simply discovering who another person is. It is grieving the death of someone who never truly existed. The image was real. The emotions were real. The hope was real. But the character living inside your imagination was assembled from pieces your own psyche desperately wanted to find. Jung understood that human beings rarely fall in love with another person's complete reality. We fall in love with possibility, with potential, with symbols. Sometimes the person standing before us becomes less of an individual and more of a mirror reflecting forgotten parts of ourselves. This explains why certain relationships feel almost mystical from the beginning. You barely know them, yet everything inside you whispers, I have known this person forever, but perhaps you have. Not them, the image, the longing, the psychological pattern searching for someone willing to carry it once again. And this is where the greatest misunderstanding begins. Most people believe heartbreak starts when someone leaves. Jung would argue something entirely different. Heartbreak begins the moment reality refuses to cooperate with fantasy. The first contradiction appears, the first broken promise, the first inconsistency, the first moment their actions no longer match the person your imagination created. Most people ignore these moments, not because they are blind, but because the unconscious protects its fantasies with astonishing determination. It tells us, they're just tired. They didn't mean it. They're under pressure. We all make mistakes. One explanation becomes another, then another, until eventually we are no longer protecting the relationship. We are protecting the illusion, and illusions always demand sacrifice. The sacrifice of intuition, the sacrifice of honesty, sometimes the sacrifice of ourselves. Long before a relationship collapses externally, it begins collapsing internally, quietly, invisible to everyone except the part of you that has been trying to speak all along, the voice you ignored, the discomfort you explained away, the uneasiness you called anxiety, the contradiction you convinced yourself would disappear with enough patience. But reality has one characteristic that fantasy never possesses. Reality repeats itself. Patterns reveal what isolated moments conceal. Sooner or later, every mask becomes too heavy to wear, and every projection reaches the moment where it can no longer survive contact with truth. That moment hurts. Not because reality is cruel, but because reality refuses to become what loneliness once imagined. And perhaps even the person who broke your heart was never the greatest deception. Perhaps the deepest deception was believing that another human being could complete a story your own soul had not yet finished writing. If the illusion feels so convincing, why does the mind create it in the first place? Why would the unconscious choose fantasy over reality? Carl Jung believed that the psyche is never random. Every image that captivates us, every person we become obsessed with, every relationship that seems destined, is trying to tell us something about ourselves. The tragedy is that we almost always misunderstand the message. We think another person has appeared to complete our life. In truth, they have appeared to reveal something that already exists inside us. Imagine entering an ancient cathedral at dusk. The stained glass windows transform ordinary sunlight into breathtaking colors. You stare in awe, believing the beauty belongs entirely to the glass. But without the light, those colors never appear. The window reveals something that was already there. Human relationships work in much the same way. Sometimes another person does not create the love you feel. There is a quiet truth that almost nobody wants to face. The people who change us the most are often the people we understood the least. That sounds impossible. How could someone we barely knew leave such a permanent mark on our lives? Carl Jung believed the answer was hidden within the unconscious itself. When we become deeply attached to another person, we are rarely responding only to who they are. We are responding to what they awaken inside us. This is why two people can experience the same individual in completely opposite ways. One describes them as compassionate, another calls them manipulative. One remembers warmth, the other remembers emotional distance. Who is correct? Perhaps both, because every relationship is formed by two unconscious worlds meeting one another. No one arrives empty. Every person carries forgotten memories, unfinished grief, hidden desires, and emotional patterns that silently shape perception. The unconscious does not simply observe reality, it interprets it, it edits it. Sometimes it completely rewrites it. Imagine standing before an unfinished painting. The artist has only completed half the canvas. Without realizing it, your imagination begins finishing the picture. You invent colors, you invent shapes, you invent an ending. Another person standing beside you imagines something entirely different. The painting never changed, only the mind's observing it. Relationships often unfold in exactly the same way. The less certainty we possess, the more imagination rushes to complete the missing pieces. Someone forgets to answer a message. One mind thinks they're probably busy. Another immediately fears abandonment. A third becomes angry. The event remains identical. Only the unconscious interpretation changes. That is why Jung insisted that understanding ourselves is infinitely more important than trying to understand everyone else. Without self-awareness, we mistake our own emotional history for objective reality. A child who constantly fought for affection may unconsciously interpret emotional inconsistency as passion. Someone raised around emotional distance may mistake coldness for maturity. Another who learned that love must be earned may feel strangely uncomfortable around people who offer affection freely. The unconscious does not seek what is healthy, it seeks what is familiar. That single realization explains decades of human suffering. Most people are not repeatedly choosing the wrong partners. They are repeatedly choosing familiar emotional landscapes, different faces, different names, the same psychological terrain. Carl Jung noticed that the psyche always attempts to complete unfinished patterns, not to punish us, but to heal us. Unfortunately, before healing becomes possible, repetition usually comes first. The same disappointment, the same betrayal, the same loneliness, again and again and again, until one question finally appears: what exactly am I searching for? The answer is rarely another person. It is usually a forgotten part of yourself. Perhaps you have been searching for acceptance, or safety, or admiration, or permission to become who you truly are. The tragedy begins when another human being becomes responsible for carrying those needs. No one can survive that weight forever. Sooner or later, They disappoint us, not because they are cruel, because they are human, and human beings cannot permanently embody another person's fantasy. Eventually, their contradictions emerge, their fears appear, their wounds become visible, the perfect image begins to crack. Most people call this the end of love. Jung might have called it the beginning of sight, because only after illusion breaks does genuine relationship become possible. Real intimacy has very little to do with perfection. It begins when two imperfect people stop demanding that each other fulfill impossible psychological roles. One of the greatest dangers of projection is that it quietly prevents us from seeing the individual standing before us. Instead of asking, "Who are you?" we unconsciously ask, "Can you become the person I need you to be?" These are completely different questions. The first creates curiosity, the second creates expectation. Curiosity accepts discovery, expectation demands confirmation. Whenever reality contradicts expectation, conflict begins. How many relationships have collapsed? Not because love disappeared, but because fantasy refused to surrender. How many beautiful connections ended because one person insisted on protecting an image that reality could never sustain, perhaps much more often than we imagine? There is another subtle consequence of projection that Jung understood deeply. When we idealize someone, we also stop seeing ourselves clearly. Every quality we admire begins living outside of us. Confidence becomes theirs, peace becomes theirs, wisdom becomes theirs, strength becomes theirs. Little by little, our own inner world starts feeling strangely empty. We begin believing that everything meaningful exists somewhere beyond ourselves. That illusion creates dependence, not love, dependence. And dependence always produces fear. Fear of losing them, fear of disappointing them, fear of being abandoned, fear of discovering that without them, we might feel incomplete. Yet perhaps the greatest deception was never believing someone else was perfect. Perhaps it was believing that you were not already carrying within yourself everything necessary to become whole. Jung devoted his life's work to one extraordinary idea. Wholeness is never given by another person. It is remembered. Every projection withdrawn, every illusion released, every unconscious pattern recognized returns another forgotten piece of your own soul. That process is rarely comfortable. It feels like loss before it feels like freedom, because the ego mourns every fantasy it must abandon, but the soul celebrates every truth it finally accepts. And perhaps that is why so many people resist seeing reality. Reality asks us to grow. Fantasy allows us to remain children. The moment you stop searching for someone to complete your story, you begin writing it yourself. That is not the end of love. It is the first moment love becomes real. They simply illuminate parts of your own psyche that have remained hidden for years. This is why certain encounters feel almost supernatural. A stranger smiles and suddenly forgotten dreams awaken. Someone speaks with unusual confidence and you begin imagining an entirely different future. Another person seems calm in the middle of chaos, and something inside you whispers, "I want to become like that." The mistake begins when admiration slowly transforms into idealization. Admiration inspires growth. Idealization demands dependence. There is an enormous psychological difference between these two states. When you admire someone, you recognize qualities you would like to develop. When you idealize someone, you unconsciously surrender those qualities to them. Instead of saying, "They are courageous," your unconscious begins saying, "They possess the courage I will never have." Instead of thinking, "They understand themselves," you quietly conclude, "They understand life better than I ever could." Without realizing it, you have transferred pieces of your own potential into another human being. Jung described projection as one of the most mysterious processes within the unconscious. Everything we refuse to recognize inside ourselves searches for an external image. Strength, wisdom, beauty, freedom, purpose, even the deepest longing for unconditional love. Rather than discovering these qualities internally, the unconscious places them onto someone else. Suddenly, they appear extraordinary, almost mythical, not because they truly possess everything we imagine, but because our own psyche has clothed them with symbols that never belonged to them. This explains why love often begins long before knowledge. You barely know someone's history. You have never witnessed how they behave under pressure. You have never seen them fail. You have never watched them navigate disappointment. And yet, you already feel certain they are different from everyone else. Reality has offered very little evidence. Projection has supplied everything else. The unconscious hates uncertainty. Whenever information is missing, it fills the empty spaces with imagination. It writes an entire psychological biography for another person using fragments of hope, memory, childhood experiences, and unmet emotional needs. The more incomplete the picture, the more room fantasy has to grow. That is why relationships often feel most intoxicating in the beginning. Distance allows projection to flourish. Mystery becomes perfection. Silence becomes depth. Scarcity becomes value. The less we actually know, the more completely imagination takes control. Eventually, life begins revealing details fantasy never anticipated. You witness impatience, fear, contradictions, moments of selfishness, emotional inconsistency. Nothing extraordinary has happened. You have simply begun meeting the real human being. For many people, this moment feels like betrayal, but perhaps no betrayal has occurred. Perhaps reality has finally been given permission to speak. Jung believed that individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole, requires withdrawing these unconscious projections, not because other people become less valuable, but because they cease carrying pieces of ourselves that never belonged to them. Every projection creates dependence. Every reclaimed projection creates freedom. Imagine carrying a lantern through a dark forest while believing the light belongs to someone walking ahead of you. You spend years trying not to lose sight of them. You panic whenever they disappear. You fear abandonment more than anything else. Then one evening, someone quietly points toward your own hands. The lantern was never theirs. It has always been yours. Nothing outside has changed, yet everything inside transforms. This is one of the most profound moments in psychological growth. The realization that the qualities we desperately sought in others were often invitations to discover forgotten dimensions within ourselves. The confidence that fascinated you, the peace that attracted you, the wisdom that inspired you, may never have belonged exclusively to another person. Perhaps your unconscious simply recognized possibilities waiting patiently inside you. And once you begin reclaiming those forgotten parts, people slowly lose their supernatural appearance. They become human again, beautiful, flawed, complex, contradictory, exactly as they always were. The miracle is not that they become smaller. The miracle is that you finally stop making yourself smaller in order to keep them extraordinary. Because the day you stop worshiping another person's image is often the first day you begin respecting your own soul. There is a strange moment that almost everyone experiences at least once. It rarely arrives like an explosion. There are no dramatic confrontations, no unforgettable arguments, no single event that changes everything. Instead, truth enters quietly, like dawn replacing the night. Almost unnoticed, you begin seeing small contradictions that once seemed insignificant, promises that are never fulfilled, affection that appears only when it is convenient, respect that depends on your silence, interest that fades the moment you stop giving more than you receive. At first, the mind resists these observations. It searches desperately for explanations. They're just overwhelmed. They've had a difficult week. They still care. They're trying. Every explanation serves the same purpose: to protect the image, not the relationship. The image. The human mind is astonishingly creative when it is defending something it desperately wants to believe. Carl Jung understood that the ego has one central mission: to preserve the story it tells about reality, even when reality itself begins contradicting that story. This is why awareness often arrives slowly. Because the unconscious knows something the conscious mind does not. If the illusion disappears, an old identity may disappear with it. For some people, their entire sense of worth depends upon being chosen. Others feel valuable only when they are needed. Some secretly believe that enduring suffering proves the depth of their love. Others mistake emotional uncertainty for passion. If these beliefs collapse, they are forced to confront questions they have avoided for years. Who am I without this relationship? Who am I if I stop trying to rescue everyone? Who am I if someone else's approval no longer defines my value? These questions feel frightening because they do not concern another person. They concern identity, and identity is one of the strongest psychological structures the ego possesses. Jung believed that whenever an identity begins to dissolve, the psyche naturally experiences anxiety, not because transformation is wrong, because transformation always feels like a small psychological death. The version of yourself that depended on illusion cannot survive truth. One of them must disappear. This explains why many people stay in unhealthy relationships long after they recognize the warning signs. Leaving is not the hardest part. Becoming someone new is. The familiar, even when painful, often feels safer than the unknown. The psyche clings to certainty, even if that certainty is suffering. Imagine spending years living inside a house whose walls are slowly collapsing. You notice the cracks, you hear the wood bending, rain begins entering through the roof. Friends warn you, your intuition whispers that something is wrong, yet you remain, not because the house is safe, because it is familiar. One day, a single wall finally gives way. Everyone says the house collapsed, but the truth is different. The collapse began years earlier. The visible destruction simply revealed what had already been happening beneath the surface. Relationships follow the same pattern. Rarely does love disappear overnight. Usually, awareness arrives first, distance appears next, acceptance comes last. By the time the relationship ends externally, besides it has often ended internally long before. The illusion simply survived longer than reality. This is why heartbreak often feels confusing. Part of you mourns the relationship. Another part quietly feels relief. Relief that you no longer have to defend something your soul already knew was ending. That feeling surprises many people. They wonder, if I loved them so deeply, why do I also feel free? Perhaps because freedom was never waiting for them to change. It was waiting for you to stop denying what you already knew. Jung often suggested that the unconscious constantly communicates through emotion. Not every emotion is truth, but repeated emotions deserve attention. The discomfort that keeps returning, the exhaustion after every conversation, the loneliness you feel even while sitting beside someone, the strange sensation that you are loved only when you become useful. These feelings are not enemies, they are messages. The unconscious speaks quietly, it rarely screams. That is why so many people miss it. They wait for certainty. Life usually offers patterns instead. Patterns are the language of reality. One disrespect can be misunderstood. A repeated pattern cannot. One broken promise may be forgiven. A life built upon broken promises eventually reveals itself. One moment of emotional distance may be understandable. A consistent inability to truly see another human being becomes impossible to ignore. Reality is patient, it never argues, it simply repeats itself until we are finally willing to see, and perhaps this is why awakening feels so painful, not because reality suddenly became cruel, but because it had been telling the truth all along. The only thing that changed was your willingness to listen. The day illusion collapses is not the day everything falls apart. It is the day everything finally begins aligning with what has always been true. For the ego, that feels like loss. For the soul, it feels like returning home. Because every illusion you release creates space for something infinitely more valuable than fantasy, clarity. And clarity, unlike idealization, asks nothing from another person. It simply asks that you have the courage to see them and yourself exactly as you are. After reality breaks the fantasy, most people believe they have learned the lesson. They promise themselves that next time will be different. They will be more careful, more observant, less trusting, less vulnerable. And for a while, they truly believe they have changed. Then months pass, sometimes years. A new person appears. The same excitement returns, the same emotional intensity, the same certainty, and somehow the ending feels painfully familiar. Different face, different voice, different circumstances, the same emotional wound. Why? Carl Jung believed that the unconscious is governed by patterns far older than our conscious decisions. We imagine we are freely choosing the people who enter our lives. Often, Our deepest wounds are making those choices long before our conscious mind becomes involved. The unconscious is strangely loyal, not to happiness, to familiarity. It does not ask, what will help me grow? It asks, what feels like home? Even when home was filled with unpredictability, even when home taught us that love must be earned, even when affection appeared only after sacrifice. The psyche remembers emotional environments long before it remembers facts. This is why someone raised around inconsistency may unconsciously mistake emotional instability for passion. Someone who spent childhood trying to gain approval may become irresistibly attracted to emotionally unavailable people, not because they enjoy suffering, because suffering feels recognizable, and what feels recognizable often feels safe. This is one of the great paradoxes of human psychology. We fear the unknown, yet we repeatedly choose familiar pain over unfamiliar peace. Imagine walking through a dense forest every day for 20 years. Eventually, a path forms beneath your feet. Without thinking, your body naturally follows it. One morning, someone tells you there is another route, a safer one, a brighter one, but your feet continue turning toward the old trail, not because it is better, because it is known. The unconscious behaves in exactly the same way. Every repeated emotional experience creates another psychological pathway. The more often it is traveled, the easier it becomes to follow again. This is why awareness alone rarely changes behavior. Many people understand their patterns intellectually. They know they overgive. They know they ignore red flags. They know they seek validation from unavailable people. Yet knowledge alone does not dissolve conditioning, because the pattern does not live in thought. It lives in the body. It lives in emotional memory. It lives in the silent expectations carried from one relationship into the next. Jung often observed that whatever remains unconscious continues directing our lives while we imagine we are acting freely. That is why some people keep saying, "I always attract the wrong people." Perhaps the question is not whom you attract. Perhaps the deeper question is, why do certain people feel so familiar in the first place? The answer is rarely comfortable. Sometimes we are not searching for love, we are searching for resolution. Every unfinished emotional experience quietly asks to be completed. The neglected child searches for someone who finally chooses them. The abandoned heart searches for someone who never leaves. The misunderstood soul searches for someone who finally sees them. None of these desires are wrong. They are profoundly human. The danger begins when another person becomes responsible for healing wounds they never created. No relationship can survive that burden forever, because every human being eventually disappoints the impossible expectations placed upon them, not intentionally, inevitably. There is another pattern that Jung considered especially dangerous: the compulsion to rescue. Some people feel most alive when they are saving someone else. They confuse being needed with being loved. At first, this feels noble, selfless, compassionate. But over time, the relationship quietly becomes unequal. One person carries, the other depends. One sacrifices, the other receives. Eventually, resentment begins replacing intimacy, not because kindness was wrong, but because kindness without boundaries slowly transforms into self-abandonment. Real love does not require one soul to disappear so another can survive. It asks two complete individuals to walk beside one another, not one carrying the other. The unconscious rarely understands this distinction. It often mistakes emotional exhaustion for devotion. Jung warned that every rejected part of ourselves continues searching for expression. If you reject your own worth, you may seek someone else's constant reassurance. If you reject your own strength, you may become dependent on someone who appears stronger. If you reject your own voice, you may spend years searching for someone who tells you who you are. Every projection becomes another chain. Every reclaimed part of yourself becomes another step toward freedom. Healing begins when the pattern is interrupted, not by finding a different person, by becoming a different observer. The moment you notice yourself explaining away behavior that makes your soul uneasy, pause. The moment you feel desperate to earn someone's affection, pause. The moment you believe your happiness depends entirely upon another person's choices, pause. Within that pause, something extraordinary becomes possible. Consciousness. For the first time, you are no longer reacting from yesterday. You are choosing from today. That single moment changes more than most people realize. Because every unconscious pattern survives through repetition. The moment repetition ends, transformation begins. Perhaps destiny was never sending you the same lesson over and over. Perhaps your own unconscious was waiting patiently, hoping that one day you would finally recognize the path you had been walking all along. And once you do, the need to repeat it quietly disappears. Not because life stops testing you, but because you are no longer the same person who first entered the forest. You have learned to recognize the old path, and for the first time, you choose another one. There is one question that few people ever dare to ask. What if the people who entered your life were never random? Not because fate arranged every encounter, not because the universe wrote every chapter in advance, but because something hidden inside you quietly recognized something hidden inside them. Long before your conscious mind decided, your unconscious had already begun choosing. Carl Jung called this hidden dimension the shadow. Most people misunderstand what the shadow truly is. They imagine it as the dark side of the personality, the place where anger, jealousy, fear, and selfishness are buried. But the shadow is much larger than that. It is everything you have learned not to be, everything you were taught to reject, everything that felt too dangerous, too painful, or too unacceptable to acknowledge. Some people hide their anger, others hide their vulnerability. Some bury ambition, others bury tenderness. Many spend decades pretending they no longer need love, not because those parts disappeared, but because they became invisible. The unconscious never destroys what is rejected. It simply moves it into the shadows, and whatever lives in the shadows continues influencing every decision we make, especially the people we feel irresistibly drawn toward. This explains something that has confused humanity for centuries. Why do we sometimes feel an immediate connection with someone we barely know? Why does one stranger leave us emotionally untouched, while another seems to awaken something ancient inside us? The answer is rarely found in the other person. It is found in the forgotten parts of ourselves they accidentally activate. Imagine entering a room filled with musical instruments. Most remain silent until someone plays a single note. Suddenly, one violin across the room begins vibrating on its own, not because anyone touched it, because it was already tuned to that exact frequency. The human psyche works in much the same way. Certain people resonate with emotional frequencies that have existed inside us for years. Sometimes those frequencies are beautiful, compassion, creativity, courage, gentleness. Other times, they emerge from wounds that have never healed, abandonment, shame, control, fear of rejection. The unconscious cannot always distinguish between what nourishes us and what simply feels familiar. That is why intense attraction is not always a sign of compatibility. Sometimes it is a sign of unfinished psychological work. The stronger the emotional reaction, the more carefully we should ask ourselves, what exactly has been awakened inside me? Very often, the answer has little to do with the other person. Jung believed that the shadow constantly seeks integration. It longs to become conscious, to be recognized rather than denied, but if we refuse to face it directly, it finds another path, projection. Instead of admitting our own hidden need for approval, we become obsessed with people who seem impossible to impress. Instead of confronting our fear of abandonment, we cling to anyone who feels emotionally unpredictable. Instead of discovering our own inner strength, we become fascinated by people who appear powerful. The unconscious is remarkably intelligent. It always finds a way to bring us face to face with ourselves, even if it must use another human being as the mirror. This is why some relationships feel almost impossible to leave. Logic says, "This is hurting me," but something much older whispers, "Don't let go." That voice is rarely love, it is attachment, and attachment often grows wherever the shadow remains unseen. Many people spend years trying to understand another person's behavior. Why were they inconsistent? Why did they pull away? Why did they change? Why did they stop loving me? These questions seem important, yet Jung would gently turn them around. A different question changes everything. Why did this relationship awaken something so powerful inside you? The answer is never simple. Perhaps they reminded you of someone you spent your childhood trying to please. Perhaps they reflected a version of yourself you secretly wished to become. Perhaps they awakened loneliness that had existed long before you met them, or perhaps they forced you to confront the parts of yourself you had avoided your entire life. That is the hidden gift of the shadow. It does not appear to destroy us, it appears to complete us. Every painful relationship contains two stories: the visible story, what happened between two people, and the invisible story, what happened inside your own psyche. Most people spend years studying the first. Very few ever explore the second, yet it is the second story that determines the future, because if the shadow remains unconscious, it will simply choose another face, another relationship, another beginning that feels strangely familiar, until one day, instead of asking why does this always happen to me? Like you ask, what part of myself keeps searching for this? That question marks the beginning of individuation, not because every answer arrives immediately, but because your attention finally shifts toward the only place where lasting transformation has ever been possible, within yourself. For perhaps the greatest illusion was never believing another person could save you. It was believing they were the source of what your own soul had been trying to reveal all along. And when the shadow is no longer feared, when it is welcomed instead of rejected, something extraordinary happens. The people you once chased no longer seem irresistible. The patterns that once controlled you lose their power. The relationships that once defined your worth become chapters instead of prisons. Because the moment you stop running from your own darkness, you also stop searching for someone else to carry it. And in that quiet moment, for the first time, your heart is finally free to choose with consciousness instead of compulsion. There comes a moment in every genuine transformation when nothing outside has changed, yet everything feels different. The people around you are the same. The streets remain familiar, the memories still exist, even the names that once stirred your deepest emotions continue living somewhere inside your mind, and yet their power over you has quietly disappeared. Not because you have forgotten them, but because you have finally stopped confusing memory with reality. This is one of the greatest psychological victories a human being can experience. Most people believe healing means no longer thinking about someone. Jung understood something far more profound. Healing is remembering them without losing yourself. There is an enormous difference. One is avoidance, the other is freedom. The unconscious has an extraordinary habit. Whenever we are emotionally attached to an illusion, it freezes time. It preserves an image exactly as we first experienced it. Perhaps they remain forever beautiful, forever kind, forever mysterious, forever capable of giving us the life we imagined. Meanwhile, real life continues moving forward. People change, circumstances change, you change, but the unconscious often continues protecting a photograph long after reality has become an entirely different story. Imagine discovering an old letter hidden inside a drawer. The paper has become fragile, the ink has faded. For years, you believe that letter contained your future. Now look, as you read it again, something unexpected happens. The words have not changed. You have what once felt like destiny, but now feels like a memory. Not because the letter lost its meaning, because you are no longer the same person who first held it. This is how psychological maturity quietly reveals itself. The world remains familiar. The observer becomes new. Jung believed that consciousness transforms reality not by changing external events, but by changing the one who experiences them. This is why the same person who once seemed irresistible may one day appear simply human. The flaws were always there. The virtues were always there. Reality had never changed. Only projection had dissolved. Many people misunderstand this moment. They think they have become colder, less romantic, less emotional. The opposite is true. For the first time, they are capable of loving another person instead of loving an image. Real love begins where fantasy ends. Fantasy says, become the person I imagined. Love says, show me who you truly are. Fantasy fears disappointment. Love welcomes truth. Fantasy clings. Love observes. Fantasy possesses. Love respects. One relationship is built upon illusion, the other upon reality. Reality is never as dazzling as fantasy, but it is infinitely more peaceful, because reality asks for nothing impossible. It does not require perfection. It does not demand constant certainty. It allows two imperfect human beings to exist without carrying the unbearable weight of becoming each other's salvation. Perhaps perhaps this is why genuine intimacy feels quieter than obsession. Obsession is loud. It consumes every thought. Every silence feels threatening. Every delay becomes unbearable. Every uncertainty creates fear. Real intimacy feels different. It breathes. It leaves space. It trusts. It allows each person to remain fully themselves, without masks, without performances, without exhausting attempts to become worthy of love. Jung often reminded us that the goal of life is not perfection, it is wholeness. Wholeness does not mean becoming flawless, it means no longer rejecting pieces of yourself, the confident self, the frightened self, the joyful self, the grieving self, the strong self, the uncertain self. When every part has a place within you, another person no longer needs to complete your identity. They simply share the journey. This changes everything. You stop chasing, you stop convincing, you stop negotiating your worth, you stop abandoning yourself simply to avoid being abandoned by someone else. Instead, you begin recognizing people exactly as they are. Some are meant to stay, some are meant to teach, some awaken forgotten strengths, others reveal unhealed wounds, none arrive by accident. But neither are they meant to define your value. Every encounter becomes information, not identity. This is the freedom that projection could never offer. You begin listening more than imagining, observing more than assuming, accepting more than controlling. For perhaps wisdom is not the ability to judge people perfectly. Perhaps wisdom is simply refusing to replace reality with fantasy. There is a quiet peace that appears once this transformation is complete. You no longer need every connection to become permanent. You no longer interpret every goodbye as proof of your inadequacy. You no longer mistake another person's inability to love you for evidence that you are unworthy of love. Instead, you recognize one of Jung's deepest psychological truths. Every human being you meet is carrying an unconscious world you will never fully understand, just as they will never fully understand yours. That realization creates compassion, not attachment. Compassion allows you to love without possession, to care without losing yourself, to walk beside another soul without demanding that they become the answer to questions only you can resolve. And perhaps this is the greatest lesson hidden inside every broken illusion. The person you spent so much time searching for was never meant to complete you. They were meant to lead you back to yourself. Every disappointment, every projection, every shattered expectation, every painful goodbye, each one quietly removed another layer separating you from your own nature. Until one ordinary morning, you look at the world with different eyes, not because the world has become kinder, but because you are no longer asking it to become your rescue. You have discovered something infinitely more valuable, the peace that exists when your happiness no longer depends upon seeing people as perfect, but upon seeing them clearly. Because the day you stop romanticizing people is the day you finally stop abandoning yourself. And perhaps that is where real love has been waiting all along, not at the end of another relationship, but at the beginning of an honest relationship with your own soul. And the day you stop romanticizing people, you finally see reality. You found Carl Jung. There is a moment in almost every person's life that feels impossible to explain. It usually arrives without warning, not during the relationship, not during the happiest memories, but long after everything has fallen apart. It happens on an ordinary afternoon. You remember someone you once believed you could never live without, their voice, their smile, the way they looked at you. For a brief instant, the memory still feels beautiful. Then something shifts, almost imperceptibly. A quiet question rises from somewhere deep inside your mind. Did I ever truly know that person? Or did I only know the story I created about them? Few questions are more disturbing because it forces you to consider something the human ego desperately wants to avoid. Perhaps your greatest heartbreak was never caused by another person. Perhaps it was caused by the collapse of an illusion. Jung believed that individuation, the lifelong process of becoming whole, requires withdrawing these unconscious projections. Not because other people become less valuable, but because they cease carrying pieces of ourselves that never belonged to them. Every projection creates dependence. Every reclaimed projection creates freedom. Imagine carrying a lantern through a dark forest while believing the light belongs to someone walking ahead of you. You spend years trying not to lose sight of them. You panic whenever they disappear. You fear abandonment more than anything else. Then one evening, someone quietly points toward your own hands. The lantern was never theirs. It has always been yours. Nothing outside has changed, yet everything inside transforms. This is one of the most profound moments in psychological growth. The realization that the qualities we desperately sought in others were often invitations to discover forgotten dimensions within ourselves. Because transformation always feels like a small psychological death. The version of yourself that depended on illusion cannot survive truth. One of them must disappear. This explains why many people stay in unhealthy relationships long after they recognize the warning signs. Leaving is not the hardest part. Becoming someone new is. The familiar, even when painful, often feels safer than the unknown. The psyche clings to certainty, even if that certainty is suffering. Imagine spending years living inside a house whose walls are slowly collapsing. You notice the cracks, you hear the wood bending, rain begins entering through the roof. Friends warn you, your intuition whispers that something is wrong, yet you remain, not because the house is safe, because it is familiar. One day, a single wall finally gives way. Everyone says the house collapsed, but the truth is different. The collapse began years earlier, is the day you finally stop abandoning yourself. And perhaps that is where real love has been waiting all along. Not at the end of another relationship, but at the beginning of an honest relationship with your own soul. End.